Mormon women in particular felt the accusation that they were forced or duped into plural marriages very keenly because,
Just sheep.
right, and that just infuriated them.
Brittany Chapman Nash is a Latter-day Saint historian specializing in LDS women's history. Men were primarily motivated to enter polygamy for sexual gratification.
We tend to like to paint polygamy with a broad brush as being one thing.
Monogamy is fair and polygamy is unfair.
If we look back at 19th century monogamy, it was just unfair all around.
The church still embraces polygamy today because men can technically still be sealed to multiple women.
Yeah, that's true. But
so if I'm going to struggle with something, I want to make sure that I'm struggling with an accurate portrayal of the thing,
yes,
right?
Love it.
We're talking about polygamy today. I want to struggle with the facts and not just the rumors, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to read off some misconceptions and just let you loose and have you clarify some things for us, if that's okay with you.
Absolutely.
We're going to jump into a big one right off the bat. Elephant in the room, probably one of the first questions that people have, or misconceptions perhaps, that people have about polygamy in early Utah. Men were primarily motivated to enter polygamy for sexual gratification. That's kind of the misconception. Now, is there any truth to that? What are the facts here?
Okay. Well, you've spoken to like the first thing that people's minds tend to go to for polygamy, and that's sexuality.
Yeah.
And certainly, yeah, that may have been true for some men and some women, that sexual gratification was a motivator. But that's just one, perhaps just one story. And when we're talking about polygamy, we have to recognize that every story is different. You know, if we're thinking about monogamy, we kind of intuitively know that every couple has their story, their own decision-making process for choosing to get married, their own experience in marriage, whether it was positive or negative. And that is kind of mirrored in polygamy, even though, you know, it's filled with more complex relationships with sister wives and tend to have like a large family of many children. We tend to like to paint polygamy with a broad brush as being one thing or being one motivation or one story. And what's exciting about polygamy is once you start looking at those individual stories, this rich tapestry kind of emerges as you learn about real people and their real experiences through their own words, I think is the best approach.
So how often, I mean, I'm thinking about the experiences, like boots on the ground experiences that I've read about polygamists, from polygamists. And like, I can't think of any where it was like, I was very attracted to this woman. And so I asked her to be my third wife or whatever, right?
Right.
Did you come across anything like that often?
No, I did come across entries in diaries like, you know, I'm thinking of one man in particular. He wrote in his diary, married Sarah. I love her and she loved me, so we got married. And
left it at that.
Yeah. And then there's other diary entries from like a woman who was very deeply in love with the man that she married. And it was considered acceptable to marry for love. That wasn't necessarily a taboo, but how people went about courtship and things like that was important. First wives' feelings were often taken into consideration, and there was sensitivity there. Many times, especially as polygamy became more developed in Utah, prospective plural wives would approach the first wife either through a letter or speaking in person and saying, hey, is this okay?
Really?
Yeah. To just like, I'm considering marriage with your husband. Are you really okay with it? Because having a positive experience and relationship with your sister wife made a huge difference in whether or not the marriage was successful or happy. And so women wanted to put themselves in good situations. And so knowing that you had the permission or support of the first wife started your marriage out on good footing.
Yeah.
But of course, that didn't always happen.
Sure.
There were, every story is different.
I've read Orson Pratt's article from The Seer where he outlines kind of
Yes.
the steps you go through to get married
Right.
polygamously.
Yeah.
And he mentions, you talk to your first wife about it, you get permission from the president of the church, you go talk to the prospective fiance's parents, you talk to then the actual woman if everybody else is okay. But I hadn't heard before that prospective fiance would often go talk to the first wife as well.
How frequently that was, I can't really speak to that, but I know it was a smart practice and that it did happen. And there were lots of stories about, how people came to eventually choose to marry. But yeah, that especially as polygamy became a practice later and people saw what worked and what didn't, what made for a successful polygamous family and good relationships. There developed these more wise practices, I suppose, to help start things off well.
So we kind of tend to jump to conclusions when we hear one man can have lots of wives.
Right.
Everybody's like, well, he's really interested in, the carnality of it, right? But based on the records that you're familiar with, at least, we don't see a ton of that per se.
Not necessarily. And you're right by bringing up the fact there was an order to things. It wasn't just a free-for-all, a guy wanted to marry someone and so they could just go and go to the temple and be married. It wasn't like that. And they also had to receive an ecclesiastical endorsement as well. So to be in good standing in the church, those were filtered through the president of the church or people that he designated before a marriage could occur. So a lot of trust was placed in those ecclesiastical endorsements. So that was also part of the process.
It wasn't like going out catching Pokemon per
Right.
se. It was it was regulated.
Yeah.
They tried to,
right.
at least.
Right.
Fantastic. Next misconception. In the 19th century, men loved polygamy and women hated polygamy.
Right. This goes along with your first point. We point to that carnality. Men are assumed to love sex. More sexual partners equals more sex. Therefore, men are all in on the polygamy train. But that was not necessarily the case at all. Like, that was one of the surprising things to me as I researched polygamy throughout my career, is how much I carried that assumption, even after years of researching the topic, and was still surprised every time I found records of men just dragging their feet, not wanting to participate in polygamy, which was very real.
What made polygamy hard for men?
So there was a lot of responsibility that came with polygamy for men who wanted to do it right and well. So first was caring for each family temporally, and having, ideally, a man would already be set financially and be able to provide homes for each wife, either a separate home or a comfortable home where they could all live together. And but that didn't always happen. There were poor men who also married polygamously, but that was the ideal scenario where a man was financially stable and able to provide well. So there was that additional responsibility he was taking on, as well as being looked to as the head of the household, because that was the perspective that women carried at the time, was that men were the head of the household, meant to enforce things, to solve domestic disputes between wives, to treat people equally. And it was difficult to satisfy all of those different emotional and spiritual needs from both their wives and children. In those situations where finances were a concern, women did need to supplement the income often. And so they would work professionally or in home industry, producing things out of their home. But, again, the men felt this responsibility to provide. So simple lust would not make a marriage succeed in this situation with what was required of spouses.
And it just kind of seems like, and I don't want to downplay the sincere questions that people have about polygamy. Like, this is something that I think a lot of Latter-day Saints struggle with, the history here. Going back to our first misconception, if sexual gratification was kind of the goal, there are a lot easier ways to achieve that goal than to get married and, have a whole additional family to support financially,
Yep.
and emotionally as
Right.
well. So I think it's just an important perspective to keep in mind.
It
Thank
really
you.
is. Yeah, to invent a theology just to entitle a man for more sexual partners just doesn't fully make sense to me, at least. And Latter-day Saint women also recognize that. There's this wonderful letter from a woman who's writing to her aunt. The author of the letter is a member of the church. The aunt is not, and she's kind of explaining what polygamy is and why people practice it. And she goes on to express exactly what you've talked about, that there are much easier ways to have affairs than to make a lifetime commitment to someone.
Yeah.
Or in the case of Latter-day Saints, an eternal commitment to someone.
So we kind of covered the male side of that misconception. What about the idea that all women hated polygamy?
Right. So there's a broad spectrum of experience there as well. Some women hated polygamy, and even those who may have stayed in plural marriages their entire lives, some just resented it the entire time.
Sure.
And other women who hated polygamy were able to divorce, which was something unique to Utah in their divorce laws. They were much more liberal than in other states in the United States. And part of that was because of the practice of polygamy to allow unhappy plural marriages to be able to dissolve more easily. And Utah was among the first to essentially have no-fault divorce, which is what we would call it now. And so that was a pressure release valve that made polygamy function so that women had an escape if they were unhappy in their plural unions, which certainly happened.
Were there women who liked it, who enjoyed it?
Yes, and there were women who thrived in polygamous families and came to deeply love and appreciate their sister wives, who loved their husbands, who lived in community with their families, and the children were taught to love one another equally as brothers and sisters. There wasn't separation between the families. Stories varied.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Again, you can't paint everybody with the same brush.
And believe it or not, it was actually not uncommon for a first wife or second wife to seek out an additional wife for her husband. And that occurred for a variety of reasons. But there were proactive steps taken by wives at times for their husband to marry plurally. And some women planned in advance for having a sister wife. Perhaps sisters or good friends would say, when we get married, let's marry together. Let's marry the same man. And so sometimes they would get married the same day. Other times there might be several years between the marriages. But yeah, it just adds a different perspective to how women viewed polygamy.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. Mm-hmm. Next misconception. All 19th century Latter-day Saints understood and agreed upon the doctrine and practice of plural marriage.
Yes, that's a good one. Today, Latter-day Saints are used to anything presented by the church to be rolled out at the same time. There's curriculum or a training manual, a form letter read from the pulpit everywhere. The church looked different in the 19th century. It was not united in the same way. There was not a united front with church leaders, and particularly with polygamy, because it started out privately, and Joseph Smith taught it to just a close circle of followers, and it was considered secret and sacred, and so it was not openly discussed. And even though the numbers of people practicing polygamy grew over time, it was not publicly announced as a practice until 1852. So you have 11 years of this quiet doctrine, this secret doctrine that, went through transition after the martyrdom of Joseph Smith. Brigham Young, and other church leaders kind of molded, what does lived polygamy actually look like? Joseph Smith introduced the concept of plural marriage and what sealing looked like in the next life. So kind of more of this spiritual, abstract idea, whereas Brigham Young and others kind of developed the practical side of plural marriage. What does it look like to live as a family? And so there's two different sides going on. And because it wasn't talked about openly, there was folk doctrine that seeped in. If Joseph Smith taught polygamy one-to-one with someone, had a private conversation, that person might share an insight like, oh, Joseph Smith told me this about polygamy. And, so it understandings varied by locality. Church leaders also shared different things from the pulpit. And even within the same sermon at times, there was contradiction. So it was, people were confused about the eternal implications of sealing. And it took time to present what plural marriage or eternal marriage meant with a united front among church leaders.
So, Latter-day Saints today look back on polygamy with a lot of confusion.
Right.
And what you're saying is that's justifiable because there was a lot of confusion at the time.
Right.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Well, this leads really well into our next misconception. Only polygamists can receive exaltation. True?
Yes.
False?
That is...
Depends on who you ask.
Right. There was misconception about that. And in fact, I would say that is where the most confusion was for people. So Joseph Smith in Revelations, as recorded in the Doctrine and Covenants, introduced 3 degrees of glory in the afterlife: telestial, terrestrial, and celestial glory. And Latter-day Saints were aiming for the celestial kingdom. And in a later revelation, Joseph Smith also said that the celestial kingdom is divided into 3 degrees of glory. And so people wanted the top, And so there was conflicting teachings about where polygamists would end up in those 3 degrees of celestial glory. And also confusion about, some people came to understand you couldn't make it to the celestial kingdom at all unless you were married polygamously. And so that motivated some to marry. Others thought, they would reach the highest heaven in the celestial kingdom by marrying polygamously. Basically, the united theme between those understandings is that a person would receive additional blessings in the afterlife because of the sacrifice they made to marry polygamously, or the increased gospel commitment they believed they were showing by marrying polygamously.
Whatever that meant,
yeah.
Right?
So after the 1890 manifesto, messages became more clear about the doctrine. We talked a little bit about folk doctrine seeping in and understandings varying by location and based on which church leaders were teaching different congregations. And so after 1890, they began looking back at scripture and speaking the same messages, perhaps to help clarify these questions and concerns that Latter-day Saints were having. If they no longer could practice polygamy, what about their eternal exaltation and their eternal glory? So they were addressing these natural concerns that had arisen. And gratefully, we have even more clarification about that today for those who are concerned, because I know for many Latter-day Saints, that's still a concern and a fear that in the afterlife, they will need to share their spouse. And that's scary and uncomfortable. But you mentioned Orson Pratt and the seer.
Mm-hmm.
And gratefully, Orson Pratt recorded very carefully the exact words of the sealing ceremony during a plural marriage and everything that happened during that ceremony. And so we have a complete record of the covenants that were made and the blessings that were promised. Elder Marcus B. Nash, who is a general authority currently, published a great article in 2015 where he confirmed that the covenants and blessings are identical between both polygamous and monogamous marriages. So from a ritualistic perspective, the covenants and blessings are exactly the same, regardless if you're monogamous or polygamous. So hopefully that can help reassure people that eternal exaltation does not ride on your monogamous or polygamous marriage status.
Yeah, that's fantastic. That's good to know. And if I understand correctly, Brigham Young wasn't particularly excited about Orson Pratt publishing
Right.
that
Exactly.
that text.
He's like, what are you doing?
Yeah.
But Orson Pratt was in the Eastern United States, trying to generate sympathy for polygamy with people there. And so he didn't get previous approval for any of
He didn't think he
wrote.
needed it, right?
Right,
He was just like, nobody told me not to.
Right.
So
why not?
We appreciate it today.
Absolutely.
Next misconception. Most women were forced or coerced into plural marriages.
So this is an interesting question. And again, it must go back to each woman's individual story. And tragically, some women did feel forced or coerced into plural marriages, either through like social or family pressure. And this wasn't just women. Men also felt that pressure. If they had a certain ecclesiastical position, they were often asked to participate in plural marriage to show an example for their congregations. So there was that very real social or religious pressure to do that.
Do you think theological pressure a little bit as well?
Absolutely. For people who wanted to be, all in Mormonism, that may have been seen as just something you needed to do to show your faithfulness. And there were a variety of different motivations for people to marry polygamously beyond just the theological or reasons or the promise of exaltation or things like that we're discussing now.
I didn't think about that kind of from a social standpoint, like the ones who are all in the gospel, right? Like those are the ones who are marrying polygamously as well. So that's an interesting motivation there that I hadn't considered before.
Yeah. And I mean, that being said, there were other Latter-day Saints who were all in, who chose not to marry polygamously.
Yeah.
And so, but there was a difference there in how people perceived the doctrine. Mormon women in particular felt the accusation that they were forced or duped into plural marriages very keenly, because that was a popular idea that was circulated in their time, was that Latter-day Saint women were unthinking beings who were duped into these marriages.
Just sheep.
Right. And that just infuriated them. They would often write about it in their own publications or in their public speeches to one another that we have records of. And one of my favorite letters, I'll read to you.
Please.
And it just is an example of how these women felt and the ownership they claimed as plural marriage being their decision. So this is by a woman named M.E. Talmage in 1883. And she wrote this in The Woman's Exponent, which is a fantastic newspaper that was published by women in Utah. And it's online, and so anyone can access it, and it's a fantastic resource to read the words of Mormon women at this time. So she wrote an article called An Indignant Mormon Mother, and she said, "I entered into plural marriage of my own free will because I knew it was right. If the women did not know for themselves that principle was true," she continued, "or if they did not wish to embrace plural marriage, where is the man or set of men who could compel them to do so? Women very frequently decline to marry good, steady, single young men and marry one who has a family. Why? Because they believe they have the right to marry the man of their choice. And if they choose to marry a man who already has a wife, they think it is nobody's business but their own." So one group we may not typically think about being forced or coerced into marriage are first wives. And this is kind of where we get into the unpleasant underbelly of the theology of polygamy that Latter-day Saints then and now are uncomfortable with. And in the Doctrine and Covenants, in the revelation on eternal and plural marriage, which is now section 132 in the Doctrine and Covenants, there are outlines what was called the Law of Sarah, which encouraged women to allow their husbands to have a plural wife if they desired to do so. And it gave an exception that if a woman refused her husband to have a plural wife, without a good reason, the man was excused from the law of Sarah and could marry anyway. So it put first wives in a very uncomfortable position if their husband disregarded their counsel or their feelings and wanted to marry plurally anyway. And that happened, which, is very sad. It was heartbreaking then. It's heartbreaking now to think that could occur. So in those cases where first wives were asked permission for their husband to marry plurally, they may have felt their hands were tied, because if they
technically could,
right,
either way.
Yeah, if the wife did not consent, and did not have a good enough reason, and who judges whether or not a reason is good enough?
Yeah.
Then her opinion could be disregarded. I have polygamous ancestry, and all of them actually were first wives. One of them was interviewed in the 1930s about her experience in polygamy. I'd always wondered if she had given her consent or not to this marriage. And gratefully, she addressed that. And she said she gave her consent, but she was human and resented it. And so I think maybe that attitude was a very real one. And I don't know how widespread it would have been, but certainly some women felt that. So from a different angle, in some cases, polygamy could have been forced upon a first wife, if not a plural.
But it's one of those scenarios where, again, every story is different.
Right.
And as we've already talked about, sounds like there were, again, women who even planned on it. That were like, me and my bestie, let's pick somebody.
Totally. Yep. Everybody was different. And some men heeded the counsel of their wife if she did not want him to marry plurally. So the most successful marriages were those made in unison, where husband and wife were on the same page.
Yeah. Well, I imagine it probably wouldn't be the foundation for a particularly happy home if you were like, hey, can I take another wife? And she was like, no. And then the husband's like, I'm going to anyway.
Yeah.
But that's a situation where then I'm grateful that those women had so much freedom when it came to divorce.
Right.
Where they were allowed to do that. Kind of at the drop of a hat, it sounds like.
Yeah, it was not typically difficult to do.
Yeah.
Socially, unlike other states in the United States that had really steep social repercussions, particularly in regard to remarriage, potentially for divorced women. In Utah, those perceptions were different. Many divorced women went on to monogamous marriages or marrying polygamously again in more favorable circumstances. So there was not the same stigma in Utah toward divorce as there was in other areas.
Or at least a reduced stigma.
Yeah.
Because I imagine, you get divorced as a woman in early Utah. I imagine there'd be a lot of people that are just like, I get it, you know?
Right.
Well, and we even have Brigham Young saying about women saying, stick with them as long as you can.
Right.
If it doesn't work out, get a divorce.
Yeah.
And it's okay.
Yeah. And women often had an easier time getting a divorce than a man who requested a divorce. So the man was expected to try and do his religious duty for as long as possible. I mean, yeah. So.
Well, is it also true that for men there was a standard of worthiness, and for women it was just kind of assumed that they were all good?
Right. It was interesting. Yeah, the man had to get the ecclesiastical endorsement for marriage.
Yeah.
But the woman didn't, and so that was interesting.
All right. Next misconception: missionaries were trafficking young women into Utah from foreign countries to feed the polygamy machine.
There's some terrifying political cartoons of this that were circulated broadly in England and Scandinavia, of these lecherous-looking Mormon males and these poor, innocent females in chains, following them to Utah. But that was not the intention of missionary work. But sometimes those fears are grounded in perhaps some truth to it. I mean,
Maybe there was a woman who came over and didn't realize that polygamy was going on.
Yeah, absolutely.
And booked it from Utah.
Right.
And then all of a sudden there's this whole story about.
Yes, absolutely. And some Latter-day Saint missionaries did meet future spouses in England or Scandinavia. So, this fear could have spread.
For anyone who wants to learn more about this, we've done a whole episode just on this question of like the trafficking from Scandinavia, and we get real deep into it. We'll link it at the end of this video. You got to finish watching this video first, then you can go watch that one. Next misconception. Most everyone in Utah practiced polygamy.
Right. So numbers, statistics,
yes.
People love and always question this, how many people practiced? And they would love a number they could hold on to. There's something reassuring of knowing exactly how many people practiced. And unfortunately, we cannot provide a number because partially because of the sheer size of the data required, particularly to look at, the 50 years worth of time that polygamy was practiced in so many different areas. And not all of those records are available. So you have some major stumbling blocks to outlining a number. But there have been some studies done looking at specific localities and, looking at different wards or areas. And I think one of the best studies that's been done was by Catherine Danes, who's a historian, and she wrote a book called More Wives Than One. And she looked at the small community of Manti, Utah, and kind of considered that sort of a representative population of general trends of what was going on in Utah. And so she provides some awesome numbers that people, are looking for. And over a 40-year period. So you get to see what happened, the decline of the numbers over time, and when polygamy was at its peak, which in Manti was between 1855 and 1857.
So that's pretty early on.
Right.
It was just announced in 1852.
Yeah.
And already by 1857. And I think generally kind of the consensus is that after 1860, it was a steady decline,
it was.
Right?
Yes. It was around this period that there was a time called the Reformation, and it's kind of a fire and brimstone period where people were being encouraged to recommit to the gospel, to marry plurally, and to do all, all the things.
Yeah.
And so there were many plural marriages made during those years, and many that ended in divorce a number of years later.
Yeah.
And that's kind of where we get the horrible stereotypes of young women marrying way older men. I mean, that occurred within that couple of year period. And a lot of those marriages later ended in divorce because, women were unhappy. So that was the height of it. And during that period, the 1860 federal census shows that in Manti, there was 43.1% of Manti residents belonged to a plural family, either as a husband, wife, or child. So we're looking at polygamous households. And almost half of the community was involved in that. So that shows how broadly it reached at its height.
Yeah.
And then, like you said, the number steadily declined each decade. 36% in 1870, 25.1% in 1880. Unfortunately, the census burned in 1890, so we don't have those numbers, but only 7.1% in 1900. And so you can see how dramatic the decline was over time.
And so naturally that we're looking at men, women, and children.
Right.
Understandably, the percentage might have been a little higher for women if we're just looking at women.
Right.
Particularly if you're comparing women and men, because one man is marrying multiple women.
Right.
But I think, growing up, I just kind of thought that it was everybody. That it was just a polygamous society, but we're still talking about less than half.
Right. Yeah. At its height, less than half.
Yeah.
And then, 1 out of 3, and then 1 out of 4, each decade it's less.
And also the fact that most men that married polygamously just had 2 wives.
Right.
And I say just 2 wives, like it's like I'm not saying that's not a difficult issue, even having 2 wives,
Right.
but I think there's this image of like all men had a dozen or more
Right.
wives.
Not at all. Mm-hmm.
And that wasn't the case.
Right. Over the period of time, it's interesting to think about how many people in Utah were part of a polygamous family, either as a husband, wife, or child. And there's tens of thousands over the period of time. So that kind of also adds perspective on just how many people were involved or had experience in polygamy somehow. Certainly, if their family was monogamous, then, probably likely relatives were polygamous. So it was normal. It had become part of the fabric of society.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't be here without it, interestingly.
Yeah.
Oh,
You're not alone.
Yeah, a lot of us wouldn't be here without it.
Mm-hmm.
Monogamy is fair and polygamy is unfair.
Yeah. Okay, so looking at numbers,
Mm-hmm.
1 man, 1 woman, fair, right?
Yeah.
1 man, 2 women, 3, 4, 5 women, unfair,
Mm-hmm.
right? But if we look back at 19th century monogamy, it was just unfair all around. I mean, the legal rights of women were paralyzing. They couldn't own property. They had no recourse if there was domestic violence. If they wanted to divorce, which was very difficult, they would lose custody of their children. So it was just extreme. Women had very few rights, very little political voice as well, so they couldn't really participate in the laws around them and things that were happening. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who was a famous suffragist and women's rights activist, kind of used the fury that was pointed at polygamy on this topic to draw attention to monogamy and just say, hey, marriage in general is unfair, So that's, yeah. And actually, women in Utah had more rights than monogamous women. They could own property. And this is largely because of the practice of polygamy to make it work, because some polygamous wives had their own house and their husband might live somewhere else. And so anyway, they could own property, they could divorce and still have custody of their children. That often happened in divorce situations, is the women would keep the children and, move on to the next step of their lives. They could vote, which they were very proud of. In 1870, they received the right to vote in their state or in their territory. And so they felt empowered to do things in their community. They could seek higher education, which was not accessible for women everywhere. So polygamy did, for all of its faults and difficulty, did in an interesting way expand the possibilities for women in Utah.
That's fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
It's I'm looking at this misconception, polygamy is unfair, monogamy is fair. And I guess it in some ways I would agree with that. In others, when you look at it from, kind of the perspective that you're offering, it's like, okay, there's a silver lining sometimes.
Yeah, it depends how you look at it. And, women often carefully weighed their decision and wanted to put themselves in a good situation. And some believed that if they didn't feel things were fair here in their mortality, they would be compensated for the difficulty in the afterlife. And some gained comfort from that belief that it would be fair eventually. And I know that perhaps doesn't offer us much comfort today, but it offered them comfort at their time.
Well, and I think we still even apply the same principle to ourselves,
right,
in different ways.
Right.
When we go through things that we don't feel are just or fair,
Mm-hmm.
at least for me, I often think, well, this is what the atonement's for, right?
Right.
Like, I don't know how, but, and I don't even necessarily know that it will become fair after this life, but at least that it will become worth it.
Right.
In some way.
Yeah. There'll be some sort of compensation. Not necessarily that you'll earn a great reward or something like that, but that you'll become someone that you're meant to become through your trials and circumstances.
So I want to shift a little bit. We've been talking about a lot of historical misconceptions, and I want to bring this to the modern era and talk about some concerns that people have today. So the next misconception, if polygamy becomes legal, the church will bring it back.
Yeah, I remember having these theoretical discussions, and that's what they are. I mean, it's just speculation. We don't know for sure. I know of nothing to indicate that we would practice it again in the future if it were to become legal. Elder Cook, within the last few years, made a statement that polygamy served its purpose, at its time. And women who practiced polygamy felt, yes, they had served their purpose once polygamy was discontinued. So will the church bring it back? I mean, I think the concept of agency is so deeply a part of Mormon theology and doctrine that agency would always play a part. I think I can safely say that no one would be forced to participate in polygamy.
Next misconception, the church still embraces polygamy today because men can technically still be sealed to multiple women.
Right. Yeah, that's true. But in 1998, a new practice occurred where women can be sealed to multiple men after their death. So we have kind of this odd dynamic, like men can be living and be sealed to multiple women. Women can, after death, be sealed to multiple men. I don't know why that's the practice right now. The current attitude of church leaders now just seems to be, we'll sort it out in the next life. Like, we don't know how it all works, but it will all be fine. So kind of this shoulder shrug of, we don't know exactly how sealings work, but there's free agency in heaven. The sealing power can bind and loosen. It's an eternal thing. So,
and the handbook now says clearly that nobody's going to be forced or stuck in a sealed relationship. Even if they are sealed,
right,
they're not going to be stuck that way for eternity against their will.
Right.
Which I think is so awesome that they added that in there.
It's wonderful to have that clarity, so people don't have to live in a state of these obscure doctrines, being overwhelmingly concerned about these obscure doctrines. Yeah. If we can somehow be okay with not knowing, be okay in the place of not knowing.
Who knows what an eternal family looks like after this life? Seal them all, and we'll figure it out when the time comes. Yeah. And it wouldn't put any core doctrines in a tricky situation if those policies were equalized.
Yeah, and you bring up an interesting point, because when the principle of sealing was first introduced with Joseph Smith, it was sort of this horizontal view of sealing. People were sealing themselves to as adopted sons and children and spouses. And so it was this view of sort of the human family coming together. I love this quote by Benjamin F. Johnson, who was taught about polygamy by Joseph Smith. He said that Joseph Smith said, "Here on earth, we are creating a nuclei of heaven, to take with us." And so that's a beautiful thought, I think, of creating a network of people you love and want to be within heaven. And so that was at one time, a view of sealing.
It reminds me of the videos where people are skydiving and 20 people jump out of the plane and 2 people link arms, and then they link arms with other people, and they make this net of people just plummeting to the earth, and then they break up and they, put their parachutes up. But I'm thinking like in the opposite direction, like we're linking arms here, or they were trying to link arms, in the 1800s in order to carry everybody up to heaven, in a sense, like to maintain that community together.
Yeah, I think that's lovely.
I think it's a beautiful concept.
It is.
To think about. Yep. I mean, again, not undercutting any questions about polygamy, but the idea of like building heaven here and then taking it with us there, or just moving it from here to there.
And eventually, I think the goal, even though we do more like vertical sealings now with uniting families, ancestors, Like eventually all of us will be united as one human family. It's the ultimate goal. And so, yeah, maybe that's heaven, everyone united together.
Yeah, even vertically. You branch out and you
do.
come back down. And
Yeah.
All right. Modern Latter-day Saints must believe 19th century polygamy was right in order to be considered faithful today.
Yes. This is, again, an area where nothing official has been stated, but I think it's quite clear that that's not the case. But just for the sake of this conversation, if we were to choose a list of what creates a faithful Latter-day Saint, I think we could look to the Temple Recommend interview questions. So if we use that rubric as what it means to be faithful, the only time during a Temple Recommend interview that a belief in polygamy was required was in 1856. And that was a long time ago.
Yeah.
And it has not been asked or required of members since.
So by 1857, that was gone?
Yeah, as far as, records that have been found or that are available. So in order to achieve the highest blessings in the temple, a belief in polygamy was not required then, except for 1856, and is not required now.
Which was right in the heart of the Reformation.
Yes, exactly. Right? Yeah. So you would imagine, because it was so important at that time, that perhaps, it would extend beyond that. But no, it was just 1 year.
Yeah.
So really what we need to ask ourselves is not, do I have to believe polygamy is right? But I believe the best question to ask ourselves is, can I live the gospel now? Do I believe what the church teaches now? And then live according to that, that answer.
That's great advice. I love that. All right. Our last misconception. We know all there is to know about polygamy.
I would love if that were the case, but a big no to that question. I think if you were to ask anyone who's devoted their career to studying polygamy, they would also unequivocally say no. They do not know all there is to know about polygamy. There's new sources that come forward that add new perspective. There's time periods such as Nauvoo polygamy, which is full of question marks because of the scarcity of sources during that time period. So there's still a lot of puzzle pieces people are trying to put together. And so no, we don't know and probably will never know all there is to know about polygamy. And I think even if a person had all of the facts that are possible, we live in a different time than they did. Even if we try really, really hard and try to place things in context, we can't put ourselves back to what life was like for them in their time period.
Any final words of advice for those watching that might be struggling with this topic?
I think coming to understand that no matter how much information a person might get, sometimes it may never make it feel better. And sometimes we just need to wrestle with the uncomfortable fact that we may never know answers to the questions we want to know. And are we okay sitting in that discomfort? Can it be okay? And what helped me personally was reading the words of polygamists. In my book, Let's Talk About Polygamy, I made a great effort to include as many different voices as I could, of people who had both positive and negative experiences, to try and present a well-rounded view of what polygamy was. And through that process, I came to feel less responsible for their decisions. I didn't realize the burden I had carried on their behalf, and recognizing that for many polygamists, this was something they deliberately chose, that they wanted. And we can just trust their decision, leave that decision with them. It's not a decision we need to make. It's something they chose by and large. So that's baggage we don't have to carry. We're not responsible for that choice.
Fantastic. And guys, if you have not read, I'll model it here for you. If you have not read Let's Talk About Polygamy yet, you really should. If you look over here, you're going to see that video that I was talking about Missionaries supposedly trafficking women into Utah to feed the plural marriage machine. You can go watch that one now. Thank you for being here. Brittany, thank you for being here.
Absolutely. Thank you.
It's been fantastic. Guys, go click that video. I'll see you there.